What if the reason getting up from a low couch feels a little harder this year has nothing to do with simply getting older, and everything to do with something sitting in your fridge right now, something a lot of people are quietly throwing half of away every single morning without ever realizing what it might be costing them? Stay with me for the next few minutes, because by the end of this video, you will know exactly which everyday food researchers keep linking to stronger legs after 60, how much of it you actually need, and the one small, very common mistake that may be working directly against your own leg strength without you ever suspecting it. If you are over 60, or if someone you love, a parent, a spouse, a close friend, is at that stage of life, then this matters more than almost anything else I could show you today, because this is not about looking a certain way in the mirror. It is about standing up from a low chair without pushing off with both arms. It is about walking down a flight of stairs without gripping the rail like your life depends on it, because in a way, it might. It is about picking up a grandchild without worrying your knees will give out underneath you, or standing through a family wedding instead of watching it from a chair on the side. Those are not small things. They are most of what makes a life still feel like your own. I am not going to spend the next 2 minutes on a channel introduction you did not come here for. I will just say this plainly, this is not a supplement pitch, and it is not an expensive program. It is one ordinary food, already sitting in most kitchens, that keeps showing up in real, published research on leg strength in people over 60. Here is something almost nobody explains clearly enough. Starting around age 40, and picking up speed noticeably after 60, the human body begins losing muscle on its own, even while the number on the bathroom scale barely moves. Doctors have a name for this, sarcopenia, but you do not need the medical word to feel it happening. You feel it as a walk that used to be effortless suddenly needing a rest stop halfway through. You feel it as needing 2 attempts to get out of a low car seat. And underneath all of that, there is usually a quiet, growing fear of falling, because some part of you knows your body will not catch itself the way it once did. I want you to picture a woman I will call Amina, 64 years old, who used to walk to her local market every single morning without giving it a second thought. Over about 2 years, that same walk slowly started needing pauses along the way. Her blood tests came back completely normal. Her doctor found nothing alarming on paper. But her legs were telling an entirely different story, and as it turns out, they were the ones telling the truth. So let's talk about what is actually happening inside those leg muscles, in the plainest language I can manage. Your muscles are being broken down and quietly rebuilt every single day, almost like a house being repaired brick by brick while you continue living inside it. When you are younger, an ordinary amount of protein at a meal is more than enough to trigger that repair work. But somewhere around your 60s, your muscles get noticeably harder to convince. Researchers call this anabolic resistance, which is really just a technical way of saying the same amount of protein that easily switched on muscle repair at 35 is often too quiet a signal by 65. Picture knocking on a door that used to open after one gentle knock, and now needs a much firmer knock before anyone inside even notices. That is not bad news, by the way. It is actually useful news, because once you know the door simply needs a firmer knock, you can figure out exactly what knocks hardest. So here's the obvious next question. If your legs need a louder signal to keep rebuilding themselves, what actually sends the loudest one? This is exactly where one very ordinary food keeps appearing in study after study, and it is probably not the one most people would guess. Inside protein, there is one specific building block researchers keep pointing to as the real trigger for muscle repair, an amino acid called leucine. Think of leucine less like fuel sitting in a tank, and more like the actual key that turns the ignition. A review published in the British Journal of Nutrition, which pulled together 9 separate clinical trials on older adults, found that leucine significantly increased the rate at which elderly participants built new muscle protein, and the researchers specifically noted this could benefit leg lean mass in an aging body. Here is why that connects so directly to one ordinary food sitting in your kitchen right now. Eggs happen to be one of the richest, most complete, most naturally leucine-dense foods you can eat without opening a supplement bottle. Whole eggs, dairy, and lean meats generally carry more leucine than most plant-based proteins, which is exactly why researchers studying muscle preservation after 60 keep circling back to them. Let that sit for a second. One of the cheapest, most unglamorous foods in your entire kitchen may be doing more for your legs than an expensive supplement ever could. Now, I already know exactly what some of you are thinking, because I hear this constantly. Eggs? Wasn't that the food doctors warned us about for decades because of cholesterol? I understand that hesitation completely. It was drilled into a lot of us for years. But nutrition research has shifted on this over the last decade, and for most healthy older adults without a diagnosed heart condition, moderate egg intake is no longer viewed as the risk it was once assumed to be. If you do have a specific heart condition, that is absolutely a conversation for your own doctor, not for a video on the internet. But for the average person over 60 with no specific medical restriction, an outdated fear of eggs may have quietly cost a lot of people the exact tool that could have helped their legs the most. Remember right at the start, I mentioned a very common mistake, something people are literally throwing away every single morning? Here it is. So many people, especially anyone watching their cholesterol, have trained themselves for years to crack the egg, toss the yolk in the bin, and eat only the white, assuming the white is the healthy part and the yolk is the dangerous one. But a study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition tested this idea directly. Researchers had participants eat either whole eggs or egg whites containing the exact same amount of protein, after a bout of exercise, then measured muscle-building activity in the hours that followed. The group eating the whole egg, yolk fully included, showed a noticeably greater muscle-building response than the group eating only the whites, even with identical protein on paper. In other words, the yolk was not just harmless. It appears to have been doing real, measurable work all along. This finding lines up neatly with a much larger study out of Harvard Medical School, built on data from thousands of adults tracked for decades through what is known as the Framingham Research Project. Investigators there found that people with the highest total protein and animal protein intake carried noticeably greater leg muscle mass than people eating less protein overall. One of the researchers leading that work has explained that getting enough protein in your diet appears to help keep leg muscles from shrinking and weakening with age, and that this might translate into a lower chance of falling. That is not a small claim. Falling remains one of the biggest threats to independence after 60. And here is a Harvard-affiliated research team connecting something as simple as daily protein habits directly to that risk. Here is why that risk deserves real attention. A stumble that would have been nothing at 30 can turn into a hip fracture at 70, and a hip fracture at that age often means weeks in a hospital bed, months of slow rehabilitation, and for some people, never quite returning to the same independence they had before. That is the quiet weight sitting behind these numbers, and it is exactly why something as ordinary as breakfast is worth 5 more minutes of your attention. But here is where this gets even more useful, because knowing all of this is one thing. Actually applying it to rebuild real strength in your own legs is a completely different thing, and that is the part almost nobody bothers to walk you through. So let's make this practical, because information without action never rebuilt a single muscle fiber. Most people, without ever realizing it, eat their smallest amount of protein at breakfast, often just toast, cereal, or a piece of fruit, and save the bulk of their protein for dinner. That timing quietly works against you, because muscles cannot store up protein overnight and withdraw it later the way you might store money in a bank account. In a 24-week program that paired a modest increase in breakfast protein with simple daily movement, researchers found that raising breakfast protein by well under 7 grams, roughly what you would gain from one extra egg, was linked to real, measurable improvements. Leg strength on a standard knee extension test improved by an average of 7 kilograms, and the time it took participants to rise repeatedly from a chair, a very real-world test of exactly the strength we are talking about, became noticeably faster. 2 or 3 whole eggs at breakfast, most mornings, is a realistic, inexpensive way to apply exactly what this research describes, especially if breakfast has always been your lightest meal of the day. If eggs are not something you can eat, whether from an allergy or simply personal choice, this same leucine advantage shows up in Greek yogurt, cottage cheese, fish, and lean poultry, so the principle still applies even if the exact food on your plate changes. So to recap that part simply, this was never only about eating more protein somewhere during your day. It is about eating enough of the right protein specifically at the meal where you are probably already eating the least of it. And here is one more layer that makes all of this considerably more powerful, though I promise this is not turning into a full workout video. Protein alone supplies the raw material, but muscle responds best when it actually has a reason to rebuild, and that is where even small amounts of movement come in. You do not need a gym membership or a personal trainer for this. Standing up from a chair 10 times in a row, twice a day, or a short daily walk, gives your leg muscles a genuine reason to use that extra protein instead of letting it simply pass through. Researchers who combined a whole food, higher protein diet with light resistance training in older adults found meaningfully greater improvements in lower body strength than exercise alone produced, which tells you that food and simple movement are working here as partners, not as separate, unrelated habits. I know some of you are already thinking this sounds like one more complicated routine to squeeze into an already full life. It genuinely is not. This is not a new diet, not a rigid meal plan, not counting grams at every single meal. It comes down to one adjustment: eat 2 or 3 whole eggs, yolk fully included, on most mornings, and add a few minutes of standing up and sitting down, or a short walk, on most days. That is the entire practical takeaway, and you could realistically start tomorrow morning without buying a single new thing. This was never about chasing your 20s again. It is about giving your legs exactly what they have been quietly asking for, so they can keep carrying you toward the people and places you actually care about. So if you take away only one thing from everything we have covered today, let it be this. The biggest mistake here was never skipping exercise entirely, and it was not even eating too little protein overall across the day. The real mistake is throwing away the yolk while eating your smallest amount of protein at breakfast, the exact 2 habits research suggests work directly against leg strength after 60. This is the kind of detail that almost 99% of people never put together, because eggs earned a bad reputation decades ago that a lot of newer research simply does not support anymore, at least not for most healthy adults. Fix the yolk, fix the breakfast timing, and you are finally working with your body's biology instead of quietly working against it every single morning. I will be completely honest with you. When I first came across this research, I went back into my own kitchen the very next morning and stopped scraping the yolk into the bin out of habit. It felt like such a small, almost silly change to make after reading actual clinical studies, but that is exactly the kind of small, unglamorous change that tends to quietly compound over months, long after most dramatic New Year resolutions have already been forgotten. If this changes how you eat breakfast tomorrow morning, do one simple thing for me. Down in the comments, type the number 1 if you have been avoiding egg yolks until today, or type the number 2 if you already eat the whole egg. I am genuinely curious which group turns out to be bigger, and I read every single comment. And if a video like this is actually useful to you, subscribing simply means the next one, on simple, research-backed habits for staying strong after 60, actually reaches you instead of quietly disappearing into the algorithm. Speaking of what's coming next, in the next video I want to walk you through one specific 2-minute daily leg movement that pairs perfectly with everything we just covered, the kind of thing you can do while brushing your teeth or waiting for the kettle to boil, so make sure you are subscribed so it actually reaches you. So here is the one-line version of everything we just covered. Your legs after 60 are not fighting against time itself, they are simply asking for a slightly louder signal, and for a lot of people, that signal has been sitting quietly in the fridge the whole time, one whole egg at a time. Strength after 60 is not lost. For most people, it is only waiting to be asked for again.